"Did you ever visit the lake house I gave you, Mom?" my son once asked me. But back then, I didn't think much of it. I simply smiled and told him I appreciated the thought. I never imagined that a single question, spoken so casually, so harmlessly, would one day unravel everything I believed about my own marriage. I'm glad you're here with me now. Follow my story until the end, and let me know where you're listening from. What I discovered didn't just shake me. It changed every memory I had of the man I spent a lifetime with. The day the lawyer handed me the keys to my husband's farm, the world seemed to tilt just a little. My husband had always forbidden me from going there. He didn't raise his voice or make threats. He simply said it wasn't a place fit for me, that I wouldn't be comfortable, that it was better if I stayed home. For decades, I trusted that explanation. At 67, trust becomes habit. But when the lawyer placed the cold metal keys in my palm and said, "He wanted you to have this," something in my chest tightened. I stared at those keys for a long moment, unable to understand why he would give them to me only after he was gone. The lawyer seemed uneasy too. He kept straightening the papers on his desk, glancing at me like he expected me to ask questions I wasn't ready for yet. Maybe that's why he spoke so softly, as if revealing something delicate. "He asked me not to mention the farm while he was alive," he said, "but it's yours now." I nodded, though confusion pressed against my ribs. Why keep something like that hidden from me? Why all the secrecy? When I stepped out of the office into the cool afternoon air, the sky felt unusually heavy, like it was holding a truth I couldn't read yet. I drove home slowly, gripping the steering wheel harder than necessary, the keys resting in my coat pocket, like a living weight. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Deeply wrong. Every corner of my quiet house reminded me of him. His jacket still hung by the door. His reading glasses stayed on the nightstand beside my side of the bed. Grief is a quiet thing, but suspicion is louder than people think. It sits behind your shoulder, breathing softly, waiting. That night, I placed the farm keys on the kitchen table, watching how they caught the glow from the overhead light. I tried to remember the last time he'd spoken about the farm, but the memory slipped away like water through my fingers. All I could recall was the way he would change the subject, how he'd say, "Another time, Myrtle," before reaching for his coat and heading outside. By morning, the questions had grown sharper. Why forbid me from going there? Why give it to me only after death? Why hadn't he ever taken me there, not even once in 41 years of marriage? I made myself a cup of coffee, but the taste barely registered. Somewhere between the steam rising from the mug and the ticking of the kitchen clock, a decision settled over me. I was going to that farm, not to sell it, not to inspect it, but because I needed answers. And because, for the first time in my life, I felt the possibility that my husband, my partner, my companion, had kept a truth from me so large it could change everything I thought I knew about our life together. The drive out to the farm took longer than I expected. It sat nearly 40 miles from my home, tucked behind a stretch of winding roads and tall pines that swayed like they had been keeping secrets for years. I don't know why, but the closer I got, the quieter my breathing became. The morning sun filtered through the windshield, soft and pale, but it didn't warm me. Not really. I kept wondering how many times my husband had driven this same road without ever mentioning it, without ever offering to bring me along. A lifetime of memories suddenly felt uneven, like a picture frame hanging crooked on the wall. The gravel crackled under the tires as I pulled up to the rusted gate. One side leaned slightly, tired from years of holding itself together. I stepped out of the car and felt the chill creeping up from the ground. The air smelled like damp soil and old wood. For a moment, I imagined him standing there, my husband in his worn flannel shirt, waving me inside with that gentle smile I used to trust without question. But the image disappeared as quickly as it came. I pushed open the gate, its hinges groaning in protest. The path leading toward the house was narrow, lined with overgrown grass brushing against my ankles. The house came into view slowly, a small, two-story structure with paint peeling off the sides, its windows clouded as if the glass itself were hiding its own memories. It didn't look abandoned, just forgotten in a way that felt personal. I paused at the porch steps, listening. Nothing. No birds, no wind, no sign that anyone had been here recently. But something felt lived in. Some subtle energy that made my heart tap a nervous rhythm. I reached the front door, and for a moment I just stood there with the keys in my hand, thumb brushing the ridges of the metal. My husband never kept things disorganized. He wasn't the type to let a property fall apart. So why this place? Why the secrecy? I fit the key into the lock. It turned easily. Too easily. Someone had oiled it recently. My breath caught a little at that, but I pushed the door open anyway. The living room was dim, the curtains drawn. Dust floated in the thin beams of light sneaking through the edges. The furniture was old but arranged carefully, like someone had tried to keep the place respectable. No trash, no clutter, just silence. I stepped inside and let the door close behind me. The floorboards creaked under my weight, announcing each step like I was entering someone else's life. I walked slowly, scanning the room. A couch with a faded blanket draped over it, a small table with a ceramic lamp, and a wooden shelf holding a few books. I ran my fingers along the spine of one. It wasn't his kind of book. He hated fiction. Near the far wall, I noticed a second pair of boots, smaller than my husband's. Women's boots. They weren't dusty. They weren't old. They didn't belong here. I stared at them, feeling the ground shift again beneath the fragile certainty I had carried with me. This place wasn't empty. Not long ago, someone else had been walking these floors. I took a breath and moved deeper into the house, the questions piling up faster than I could make sense of them. Every corner seemed to whisper something I couldn't quite hear. When I reached the kitchen, I stopped short. 2 coffee mugs sat in the sink. 2. One with lipstick on the rim. A sting pulsed in my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Just a strange, hollow ache that settled under my ribs. My husband had never been one to drink coffee alone. For years, we shared a cup every morning at the same time, like a quiet ritual that anchored the start of our day. Seeing 2 mugs here felt like betrayal disguised as a domestic routine. I stood in that kitchen for a long moment, letting the silence press around me, letting the truth inch closer. And as I looked around the room that held pieces of a life I didn't recognize, one thought settled into place with heavy clarity. Someone had been here with him. Someone he chose not to tell me about. And I wasn't leaving until I knew exactly who that was. I moved slowly through the rest of the kitchen, my fingertips brushing across the counter as if the surface might tell me something my eyes couldn't. The faint scent of something sweet lingered in the air, vanilla, maybe. Not mine. Not his. It felt recent, like it hadn't fully faded. I opened the drawers one by one, careful not to make noise even though I knew no one was here. Silverware neatly arranged, dish towels folded. Someone had cared enough to keep this place tidy. Someone who wasn't me. At the end of the hallway was a closed door, the kind of closed that felt intentional. I hesitated before reaching for the knob, my pulse tapping a slow warning under my skin. I pushed it open gently, and the room revealed itself in pieces. A small bed, a dresser, a round mirror with a crack down the side. But it wasn't the furniture that made me stop. It was the scarf hanging on the back of the chair, blue with white stitching. I'd never seen it before, but it was unmistakably feminine, unmistakably used. I picked it up, feeling the soft fabric between my fingers. There was a faint perfume on it, nothing like the subtle scents I wore. This one was floral, lively, too young. I lowered the scarf and looked around again. On the dresser sat a hairbrush with strands of long auburn hair tangled in the bristles. My breath hitched as the truth edged closer, but I still wasn't ready to name it. I stepped back, my hands steady, even though my chest felt tight. In the corner of the room, a small wooden box caught my eye. It was plain, almost forgettable, but something about how it sat, just slightly angled as if recently moved, pulled me toward it. I knelt down and lifted the lid. Inside were letters, old, creased, tied with a thin ribbon that had frayed at the edges. The top envelope had my husband's handwriting. I recognized the loops of his R, the way he slanted his Y, but the name on it wasn't mine. I ran my thumb across the unfamiliar name, the strokes deeply pressed into the paper as if he'd written it with intention. A whisper of betrayal curled through me, not loud, not sharp, just steady. I pressed the envelope back into the box and closed the lid. I didn't open the letters. Not yet. Not until I understood what I was standing in the middle of. As I stood, the floor creaked under my heel, reminding me I wasn't done with the house. There were still places I hadn't looked, still shadows holding things I needed to see. I went back to the hallway. There was another door, one leading to the back of the house. When I opened it, a draft of cool air brushed my face, carrying the faint smell of old wood and hay. A narrow staircase led down to a basement. I hesitated, gripping the railing. The light switch didn't work, so I used the small flashlight on my phone. The beam revealed shelves lined with boxes, stacks of old tools, and dust that swirled like tiny ghosts when I stepped forward. I scanned the room slowly, letting the light move across surfaces until it landed on something that didn't belong, an old suitcase sitting near the far wall. It wasn't his. He hated suitcases and preferred duffel bags. This one was a deeper red, worn at the edges. I kneeled beside it, hands steady, and unlatched the metal clasps. Inside were clothes, women's clothes, and a small photo tucked into the corner. I pulled it out carefully. A woman stood beside my husband, both smiling in a way I hadn't seen from him in years. That alone was a sting. But the second sting came from what the woman held in her arms. A little girl with his eyes. I felt something shift inside me. Not shock, not rage. Something quieter, something heavier. A truth settling in the space between what I once knew and what I now had to accept. I slipped the photo back into the suitcase and closed it gently. My fingers rested on the lid for a long moment before I stood. The beam of my phone swept across the basement again, landing on the bare walls, the quiet corners, the shadows that no longer felt empty. And as I climbed the stairs back to the main floor, one thought moved with me. Steady, cold, unavoidable. My husband had built another life here, and he never meant for me to find it. I walked back into the living room, feeling the air shift around me, heavier now that I knew the truth was no longer a distant possibility, but something solid, something I had touched with my own hands. I sank onto the edge of the couch and let the quiet settle. My husband had always been good at silence. Now I understood why. It wasn't peace he wanted. It was cover. I looked around the room again, not as a visitor, but as someone searching for answers. Every detail felt different now. The blanket on the couch wasn't just a blanket. It belonged to someone who had lived here. The boots by the door weren't just boots. They were worn by a woman who had walked beside him while I waited at home, trusting, unaware. And the two mugs in the sink, they felt like a memory I was never meant to witness. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, letting the weight of everything settle across my shoulders. I thought back to the last year of his life, his sudden errands, the evenings he claimed he needed to clear his head, the way he brushed off my questions with soft reassurances that meant nothing now. I had never doubted him. That thought stung more than anything I had found in the house. My gaze drifted toward the wooden box I'd left in the bedroom. The letters inside tugged at me like a whisper. I wasn't ready when I first found them, but now the hesitation felt pointless. I went back to the room, picked up the box, and carried it to the kitchen table. I untied the ribbon slowly, almost ritualistic, as if giving myself one last moment before stepping into a truth that would change my marriage even in death. The first letter was dated nearly 12 years ago. I unfolded the paper, my hands steady, even as my heart pressed against my ribs. His handwriting was warm, familiar, but the words were not meant for me. He wrote about the farm, about spending afternoons fixing the fence, about someone who brought him coffee with too much sugar. He wrote about the little girl learning to ride a bicycle on the gravel path, about how her laugh reminded him of hope he thought he had lost. I set the letter down, breathing through the tightness in my chest. Hope he thought he had lost. What did that make me? The life he wanted or the life he settled for? I didn't read the second letter immediately. I just stared at the one in front of me, letting the truth press deeper. Eventually, I picked up the next one, then another. Each letter wove a story he had never shared. A story of moments, routines, small joys, a life built parallel to mine. Not a replacement, not entirely, but something he nurtured in secret, something he protected. When I reached the final letter, my fingers trembled for the first time. It was written only months before he passed. He wrote about being tired, about time running thin. He mentioned me once, briefly, tenderly, but even that line felt like an afterthought. The rest of the letter was dedicated to the farm, to the people there, to the life he was terrified would fall apart without him. I folded the letters back into the box and closed the lid. The betrayal didn't scream. It didn't explode. It just settled, heavy and steady, like it had been waiting for me all along. I looked around the house again, at the walls that held his other life, and for the first time since stepping inside, I understood something clearly. This place wasn't abandoned. It wasn't forgotten. It wasn't even finished. It was simply paused, waiting for the truth to catch up. And now it had caught me. I stayed seated at the kitchen table for a long time, the wooden box in front of me, like a quiet witness. The letters had taken the shape of a truth I could no longer sidestep. I felt the house around me differently now, as if it breathed with its own memories I wasn't part of. The silence pressed against my ears until every small sound became sharp. The ticking of the old wall clock, the settling of the floorboards, the faint hum of my phone in my coat pocket. I wasn't alone in the way I had been before. I was alone in a place where someone else had once felt at home. I finally stood and walked back into the living room. Through the dusty window, I saw the outline of a figure approaching from the dirt path that ran along the fence line. My heart tightened instinctively. The letters had prepared me for many possibilities, but not for someone walking toward the house. I stepped slightly to the side, positioning myself where I could see without being seen. The figure moved slowly. An older man, hunched slightly, wearing a worn jacket and holding a small grocery bag. He paused at the porch steps, looking at the house like he had done this many times before. I waited, unsure of whether to open the door or hide. But he made the decision for me. He knocked, gentle and hesitant, as if he already knew the house felt different today. I opened the door only halfway. His eyes widened the moment he saw me, not with fear but with recognition. "You're Myrtle," he said, voice quivering just enough to reveal surprise. "You look just like the picture on the mantel." I felt something shift inside me. A picture of me? Here? He held the grocery bag up a little. I come by once a week, just to check the place, make sure nothing leaks or breaks." His gaze flicked past me into the house. "Where's John?" My husband's name in a stranger's mouth felt heavier than the box of letters. "He's gone," I said quietly. "He passed a few months ago." The man's shoulders slumped with genuine sorrow. He didn't tell me he was sick. He shook his head, then looked at me again. "I'm sorry. He was a good man. Complicated, but good. Complicated." The word fit too well. I stepped aside and let him in. He wiped his boots carefully on the mat, a habit formed over years of being welcome here. That alone stung. I led him to the living room, and he set the grocery bag on the table. Inside were canned goods, bread, a carton of milk. Supplies not for him, supplies for someone who lived here. He glanced toward the hallway. "They moved out a while back," he said softly. "Your husband, he helped them, made sure they had what they needed." He hesitated, then added, "He loved that little girl. Anyone could see it." I didn't ask which girl. I didn't need to. The picture in the suitcase told me enough. The man looked down at his hands, rubbing his knuckles. "He talked about you," he said unexpectedly. "A lot, actually. Said you were stronger than anyone he'd ever known." His voice softened. Said he wished things had been different. A strange ache pulled through my chest, not comfort, not forgiveness, just acknowledgement of the messy truth I was standing in. He cleared his throat. "If you want, I can keep checking the place, or..." He trailed off, waiting for my direction. I shook my head gently. "No. Thank you. I'll take it from here." He nodded, understanding more than I said aloud. Before leaving, he touched the hat in his hands, a gesture of respect that felt almost out of place. "If you need anything," he said, "I'm just down the road." When he was gone, I stood in the doorway and watched him disappear along the path. He moved slowly, like a man used to carrying secrets that weren't his to keep. I closed the door and leaned against it, breathing in the quiet that returned. The groceries sat untouched on the table. The letters waited in their box. And somewhere in this house, pieces of my husband's other life still lingered. But the man's words echoed through me, steady and undeniable. He wished things had been different. I didn't know what to do with that yet, but I knew it mattered. I stayed by the door for a moment after the old man left, letting the quiet settle again. His presence lingered in the air, along with the truth he carried so easily. Truth that had taken me hours, letters, and a house full of ghosts to even touch. I walked back to the kitchen table and looked at the grocery bag he'd brought. Milk, bread, canned soup. Ordinary things meant for ordinary days. But here, in this house, they felt like evidence. Evidence of a life maintained in secret. Evidence of a routine that didn't include me. I pushed the bag aside gently and sat down. My fingers traced the rim of the top letter in the box, but I didn't open it again. I didn't need to. Not right now. I already knew enough to feel the shape of the truth pressing in from every corner. Still, there was something unfinished about the house, something I hadn't seen yet. And the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger the feeling grew. I stood and moved down the hallway again, this time more slowly. The scarf on the chair looked softer in the afternoon light. The hairbrush on the dresser caught a faint glint. Every detail seemed deliberate, as if the people who lived here had expected to return. That thought tightened something inside me. The letters hinted at years. The picture in the suitcase said even more. And the child, his child, though I couldn't bring myself to say it aloud, had been part of this place too. I stepped into another room I hadn't checked yet. A small study. Papers stacked neatly, a desk lamp, a chair pushed in carefully. There was a calendar on the wall, months behind, with a few dates circled in red. I stepped closer. The circles marked the same days each month. No names, no notes. Just red ink around dates that must have meant something to him. To them. I didn't know which was worse, that I had been left out or that I had never thought to question it. A voice inside me whispered that I should go home, leave everything for now. But another part of me, a quieter, steadier part, told me to keep looking, to understand fully before walking away. I checked the drawers, receipts, a set of keys, a notebook with a grocery list written in someone else's handwriting, and under all of that, a folded page torn from a larger sheet. The handwriting was his. It was a partial letter, maybe one he never finished. The edges were uneven, torn in haste or frustration. I read the first few lines slowly. I'm running out of time to do this right. I don't want to leave her with questions. She deserves more than the pieces I've given her. The letter didn't say who she was. It didn't need to. That was the problem. Every possibility hurt. I folded the page and slipped it into my pocket. Not because I needed proof, but because I needed something small to hold on to while I walked the rest of the house. When I stepped back into the hallway, something caught my eye. A door I hadn't noticed before. It was at the far end, almost flush with the wall, painted the same color so it blended in. I reached for the knob. It stuck at first, but after a second turn, it opened. Inside was a narrow storage room. Boxes stacked against the walls, some labeled, some not. The air felt cooler here. I picked one of the unlabeled boxes and lifted the lid. Inside were children's toys, a small wooden train, a stuffed bear worn from being held too tightly, crayons bundled with a rubber band. My throat tightened. These belonged to the child in the photograph. They were her memories, her beginnings. I set the toys down and opened another box. Clothes, little sweaters, a pair of shoes barely the size of my hand, and tucked in the corner a birthday card. I opened it. The handwriting was big, wobbly, the kind of early letters children draw when they're proud to know their shapes. "Thank you," it said. No name, just gratitude. I placed the card back gently. My hands felt heavier than they should. As I stood and looked around the storage room filled with pieces of a life I had never known, one thought rose above the others, steady and painful. He hadn't just kept a secret. He had built a world, and I was the last person he expected to ever see it. I stood in that narrow storage room until the air felt too still, too heavy to breathe. The boxes around me weren't just objects. They were confirmations. Quiet, careful confirmations of everything my husband had chosen to hide. I closed the last box gently and stepped back into the hallway, letting the door fall shut behind me. The soft click of the latch echoed through the house like a small ending, or a beginning. I wasn't sure anymore. I walked to the living room again and sat down, my knees aching in a way I hadn't noticed earlier. Grief had its own weight, but this was different. This was the kind of weight that settled in the bones. I rested my hands on my lap and let my eyes wander across the room. Everything here carried his touch, his habits, his routines, but also someone else's presence woven through it. A shared life, a shared home. A shared secret. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket, startling me. I pulled it out and glanced at the screen. A message from my son. "Mom, are you okay? Haven't heard from you today." I stared at the words for a long moment, unsure how to respond. If he knew anything about this place, this life, he had never shown it. But his message felt strangely timed. I typed a simple "I'm fine" and put the phone aside. I didn't have the strength to write anything more. I needed air. I stepped out onto the porch, the boards creaking beneath my feet. The sky had shifted into a softer shade of blue, clouds stretching thin across the horizon. The quiet of the land felt different now, less peaceful, more expectant. I walked down the steps, my shoes brushing against the gravel, and followed a small path that led behind the house. Halfway down, I noticed a small shed tucked against the tree line. It was plain, almost forgotten looking, with a single window and a padlock on the door. The sight of the lock sent a familiar pull through my chest. Another locked space. Another thing he meant to keep sealed. I stood in front of it, studying the padlock. It wasn't old. Someone had put it there recently. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the ring of keys the lawyer had given me. There were several, each different in shape and size. I tried the first one. It didn't fit. Then the second. No luck. But the third slid in, turned, and clicked. The sound was soft, but it carried enough weight to make my pulse thrum. I pushed the door open slowly. Dust floated in the air, stirred by the thin strip of sunlight entering from the window. At first, the shed looked empty, just shelves, a workbench, and old tools. But as my eyes adjusted, I noticed a stack of boxes in the corner, covered by a canvas sheet. I lifted the corner of the cloth and saw more children's items, school supplies, notebooks, a lunchbox with faded stickers. I opened the lunchbox. Inside was a folded drawing. A child's handwriting labeled the figures, a man, a woman, and a girl holding their hands. The man looked like my husband. The woman had long hair. The girl was the same one from the photograph. My breath caught. I set the drawing down gently. My hands weren't shaking. They were too tired to shake. On the workbench lay a small notebook. I opened it to the first page. It wasn't my husband's handwriting. It was hers, the woman from the suitcase photo. The entries were brief, handwritten with care, notes about school pickups, about groceries, about the girl losing her first tooth. And then I reached the last entry, dated only weeks before my husband passed. He said he's hurting more these days, said he doesn't want to cause trouble for anyone. I hope he finds peace. I closed the notebook slowly. Not out of anger, not out of fear, out of realization. My husband hadn't been hiding a scandal. He had been hiding a responsibility, a history, a connection he didn't know how to explain. Maybe even something he couldn't abandon. I sat on the edge of the workbench, letting the truth settle in pieces, not dramatic, not sharp, just steady. The shed was quiet, holding its secrets without apology. I looked around one more time and then stepped back outside, locking the door behind me. As I walked toward the house, one thought stayed with me, clear and calm. The truth wasn't loud. It was patient, and it had been waiting for me all along. I walked back toward the house, with the late afternoon light stretching long shadows across the yard. Each step felt slower than the last, not because I was tired, but because everything around me carried a meaning I hadn't seen before. The shed, the toys, the notebooks, the letters. This place wasn't a mistake or a brief chapter in his life. It was something he had nurtured quietly, piece by piece, while I waited at home, believing I knew the whole story. Inside the house, the air felt warmer than before, as if the walls themselves had absorbed all the secrets they'd held for so long. I stood in the living room again, taking in the details that once looked insignificant. The worn spot on the armrest, the faint impression on the couch cushions, the small lamp that gave off a soft amber glow. These weren't signs of neglect. They were signs of presence. Someone had loved this place. Someone had lived a life here that overlapped with his. I moved toward the kitchen, drawn by a quiet determination I hadn't felt earlier. There was still something missing, something I hadn't found yet. I opened the cabinets again, checking each one, not for items, but for the story they held. Some held nothing unusual. Others had small things. 2 mismatched cups, a jar of honey nearly empty, spices he never used at home. Small domestic details that made the separation between his 2 lives feel even sharper, Then I noticed a drawer I hadn't opened before near the end of the counter. It stuck slightly when I pulled it, catching on something inside. When it finally gave way, I found a pile of papers, old receipts, envelopes, documents that had been hastily tucked away. I sifted through them slowly. Most of it was unremarkable: grocery purchases, hardware store receipts, car maintenance notes. But then I found something that made me pause. A medical bill. Not for him, for the little girl. Dated years ago. Paid in full. The name on it matched the one on the letters. My chest tightened, not with anger, but with the heavy realization that my husband hadn't simply been living a second life. He had been supporting one. Quietly, consistently, without fail. I placed the bill aside and kept going. Another document. This time larger. A form from a local school district. His signature at the bottom, next to hers. The woman from the photo. They had signed it together. Not as a couple, but as guardians. The responsibility was clear in the ink, even after all these years. I exhaled slowly and leaned against the counter. My husband hadn't been careless. He hadn't been reckless. Everything he did here was intentional, structured, steady. He'd kept them off the grid of our marriage, tucked away in this place, but not out of neglect, out of obligation. Maybe protection, maybe fear, but definitely care. I folded the papers neatly and placed them back in the drawer. Then I walked down the hallway, drawn back to the bedroom with the scarf and the hairbrush. The window there overlooked the small path leading toward the trees. I stood in front of it and let my eyes follow the trail until it disappeared into the woods. It was then that I noticed something. A small mailbox near the edge of the property, half hidden by tall grass. I hadn't seen it earlier. I wasn't sure how I missed it, but now it stood out like a quiet invitation. I stepped outside and walked toward it, brushing aside the grass as I reached for the handle. Inside were letters. Not old, not yellowed, recent. I pulled out the stack and checked the postmarks. All from the last 5 months. The return address was the same each time. A different town. Not far. I opened the top one carefully. Inside was a short note. Please tell her I hope she's okay. I think about her often. There was no signature, but I knew who it was for, and I knew who it was from. I placed the letter back in the envelope and held it against my chest for a moment, letting the quiet of the field settle around me. He hadn't abandoned anyone. He hadn't chosen one life over another. He had simply carried 2 truths at once. And now one of those truths was standing in my hands, waiting for me to decide what came next. I carried the stack of recent letters back into the house, holding them carefully, as if the paper might crumble under the weight of what they contained. I set them on the kitchen table beside the wooden box of older letters. 2 timelines. 2 hidden lives. One man I thought I knew. I pulled out a chair and sat down, smoothing the top envelope with the palm of my hand. The ink was fresh, the handwriting steadier than I expected. Someone had written these with hope, someone who believed my husband was still reading them. For a moment, I just stared at the envelopes, letting the quiet settle. Outside, the wind pushed gently against the house, the boards creaking like an old friend clearing its throat. I picked up the top letter again and opened it, reading the words slowly. Nothing dramatic, no confessions, just simple human worry. I hope she's okay. I hope she's safe. Tell her I think of her. No demands, no accusations, just care left hanging in the air, unanswered. I placed the letter down and looked around the kitchen again, seeing the layers of truth stacking in front of me. The farm wasn't a hideout. It was a tether. A bridge between my husband and a world he didn't know how to bring home. I felt a steady ache. Not sharp, just deep, like the kind that settles in the joints when the weather turns cold. I walked back toward the living room and noticed something I hadn't paid attention to earlier. A picture frame lying face down on a shelf. The dust around it was disturbed, like someone had moved it not long ago. I picked it up and turned it over. Inside was a photo of my husband sitting on the porch steps of this very house. His smile was small but real. Next to him sat the little girl, her legs swinging freely, and on the other side was the woman from the suitcase photo. The 3 of them looked comfortable, like a family captured in a moment between breaths. I swallowed hard and set the frame upright on the shelf, its glass catching a sliver of sunlight. It didn't feel right anymore to hide the picture, not when everything else had already stepped into the light. I decided to explore the rest of the house again, not searching for secrets this time, but for understanding. I walked into the small study and noticed the calendar again. The circled dates. I traced one with my finger, wondering what it marked. A birthday? A visit? A promise he kept quietly? The answers didn't come, but the pattern mattered. He had been consistent. He had been present in ways I had never imagined. On the desk, tucked under a stack of papers, I found a small envelope addressed to M. Just the letter, nothing more. My initials. I opened it cautiously. Inside was a short note in his handwriting. I never wanted to hurt you. I just didn't know how to make everything right. I pressed the note between my fingers. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't an explanation. But it was honesty. Maybe the first honest thing he had written to me in years. I folded it carefully and placed it in my coat pocket, letting its weight rest close to my heart. The day was beginning to dim when I stepped outside again. The fields behind the house shimmered gold in the fading light. I walked slowly toward the fence line, where the grass grew tall and wild. The mailbox stood quietly, the door still open from earlier. I closed it gently, as if sealing a conversation that wasn't finished yet. When I turned back toward the house, I saw movement near the porch, a figure standing still, half in shadow. My breath hitched before I recognized him. It was the older man who had visited earlier. He raised a hand in a small wave. "I wasn't sure if you were still here," he said as I approached. His voice was soft, respectful. "I thought you might have left." "Not yet," I replied. My voice felt steadier than I expected. He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting toward the fields. "This place meant a lot to him," he said. More than he ever said out loud. I looked at the house, its windows catching the last of the sun. "I know," I said quietly. "I'm starting to understand." The man hesitated, then spoke again. "There's someone you should talk to," he said. "Someone who can tell you the parts of the story he never could." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and earth. I straightened slightly. "Who?" He looked at the path leading away from the house. "His daughter," he said. I didn't answer right away. The truth didn't jolt me. It simply settled, fitting into the empty space that had been waiting for it. I knew this moment would come. I just didn't know it would feel this calm. The man pointed down the narrow dirt road, the same one he had walked earlier. "She lives not far," he said. "A few houses past the bend. She's grown now, has a family of her own." He shifted his weight, his boots pressing into the gravel. "She might want to know you're here." I let the words settle. Grown now, a family of her own. Time had moved forward for her just as it had for me, but on completely different tracks. I nodded slowly, more to myself than to him. "I'll go," I said. He gave a small nod back, like he had expected that answer all along. After he left, I stood alone on the porch for a moment, hands resting on the railing, eyes following the line of the road stretching into the distance. The air cooled as the sun dipped lower, turning the sky into a wash of pastel colors. I walked inside long enough to grab my coat and the small torn letter from my husband, the unfinished apology he never found the courage to deliver. It felt right to bring it with me. The walk to her house was quiet. The gravel crunched softly under my steps, and the evening breeze rustled through the tall grass. I tried to imagine her as the little girl in the photo, legs swinging off the porch, laughing beside a man I had loved for more than 40 years. It felt strange, almost surreal, to think that a child who shared his eyes had grown up without my knowledge. By the time I reached the small white house at the end of the lane, the sky had faded into twilight. Warm light glowed through the windows. A wind chime tinkled gently by the door. I stood for a moment, steadying my breath, then knocked softly. The door opened a few inches, and a woman in her 30s looked out. Her hair was a deep auburn, the same color I'd seen in the hairbrush in the bedroom. And her eyes, those were unmistakably his. When she saw me, confusion flickered across her face, followed by something like recognition she couldn't quite name. "Can I help you?" she asked. I cleared my throat gently. "My name is Myrtle," I said. "I was married to John." She froze. Not in shock, not in fear, just in understanding. Something in her posture softened. She opened the door wider. "You should come in." Her living room was warm, modest, lived in. Toys scattered in a corner, a blanket draped over the couch. She gestured for me to sit, then took the chair across from me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "I found the farm today," I said quietly. She let out a slow breath and nodded. "I wondered if you'd ever go there." Her eyes dropped to her hands. "He never wanted you to find out this way." I reached into my coat and placed the torn letter on the coffee table between us. "I think he didn't know how to tell me," I said. "I don't think he knew how to tell anyone." She looked at the paper, then brushed a thumb over the frayed edge like it was familiar. "He carried a lot," she whispered. "More than he ever let on." I nodded. "I know that now." There was a long pause, but not an uncomfortable one, just two women sitting with a truth neither had chosen. "I want you to understand something," she said finally. "He helped us, yes, he supported us, but I never asked him to choose between lives. He did that on his own." She looked at me then, her gaze steady. "I never wanted to take him from you." Her words were simple, but they settled into me with a surprising grace. She wasn't the villain I had expected to find at the end of the road. She was just a woman who had been part of a complicated story, one he had written quietly, in the margins of his life with me. We talked for a while longer. Not about blame, not about betrayal, just about the man we both knew differently. When I finally stood to leave, she walked me to the door. "He loved you," she said softly, "in his way." I nodded, meeting her eyes. "And he loved you too," I said, "in his way." Outside, the night air felt cool against my skin. I walked back toward the farm, the torn letter pressed in my pocket, the shadows stretching long across the ground. I didn't have all the answers. But I had truth now, layered, imperfect, and heavier than I expected, and I was ready to carry it. Walking back toward the farm, I felt the weight of the night settle around me. Not heavy, not frightening, just real. The kind of quiet that comes after a truth finally stops hiding. The gravel crunched beneath my feet, and every step felt like I was moving through memories that were never mine, but somehow now belonged to me too. When the house came back into view, its windows faintly glowing in the dark, I realized I wasn't walking into a secret anymore. I was walking into clarity. Inside, the house felt different. Not because anything had changed, but because I finally understood the story behind each small detail. I hung my coat on the hook by the door and set the torn letter on the table. The lamp in the living room cast a warm glow over the furniture, catching the edge of the picture frame I'd turned upright earlier. Their smiles seemed softer now, less like a betrayal, more like a truth that had been waiting to be acknowledged. I sat down on the couch, letting the quiet settle around me. The conversation with his daughter replayed in my mind, not the words, but the tone. Calm, honest, without blame. She wasn't angry that I existed, and I wasn't angry that she did. We were both simply two pieces of a life he had divided, doing our best to understand the man who tied us together. My phone buzzed again, a reminder that the outside world still existed. Another message from my son. "Mom, call me when you can." I stared at the screen. I didn't answer. Not yet. How could I explain any of this without the story sounding like an accusation? And how could I be sure how much he knew, if anything? The questions pressed against me, but for the first time all day, they didn't overwhelm me. They just waited. I stood and walked through the house one more time, not searching now, just seeing. The blanket on the couch, the dishes in the sink, the scarf on the chair, the teddy bear in the storage room. These were remnants of people who had lived, loved, struggled. And at the center of it was a man who tried to carry two lives without letting either one fracture completely. In the bedroom, I sat on the edge of the small bed and picked up the scarf once more. The scent was faint now, but familiar in a way I hadn't expected. Not because I knew her, but because I recognized the care behind it. Someone had loved this life enough to leave a piece of themselves behind. I folded the scarf neatly and set it beside the hairbrush, as if putting pieces back where they belonged. I walked back to the kitchen and opened the drawer with the documents. The school forms, the medical bills, the signatures. I gathered them into a small stack and placed them in a folder I found in the desk. Not to hide them, not to erase them, but to give them a place that felt intentional, a place where the truth could rest without being buried. As I closed the folder, I felt a quiet shift in myself. I wasn't angry. I wasn't broken. I was simply awake to a life I hadn't known I was living. A life shaped by choices I hadn't been part of, but choices I could now understand. I returned to the living room, turned off the lamp, and stood by the window. Outside, the moon cast a soft silver glow over the fields. It felt like the land was breathing with me, slow and steady. I pressed my hand against the cool glass and let the moment settle. This house wasn't mine, and it wasn't hers. It belonged to the truth. And the truth finally belonged to me too. I took a slow breath and whispered into the quiet room, "I know now." It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't closure, it was acknowledgement. And somehow, it was enough for tonight. The night deepened around the farm, wrapping the house in a quiet stillness that felt almost protective. I stood for a moment longer by the window, letting my breath fog the glass before stepping back. The lamp on the table glowed softly, casting warm light across the room, and I realized this was the first time the house didn't feel like a stranger to me. It didn't feel like his secret anymore. It felt like a place holding pieces of a truth that belonged to all of us now. I sat down at the kitchen table, the torn letter still lying where I had left it earlier. I smoothed it gently with my fingertips. For so long I had believed I knew everything about the man I spent 4 decades of my life with. Tonight I understood something different. Sometimes people carry burdens quietly, not out of deception, but out of fear that their truths will break the people they love. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into the folder with the other documents, not to bury them, but to keep them safe. The truth deserved a place, even if it hurt. Especially if it hurt. My husband had spent years building 2 lives, unsure how to merge them, and in the end, he left both behind for me to find. It wasn't fair, but it was real. I stood and walked once more through the house, touching the back of the couch, the edge of the doorway, the banister worn smooth by hands that weren't mine. I opened the front door and stepped outside. The night air smelled of pine and soil, a scent that felt grounded and honest in a way I needed. The moon hung low over the field, and the wind rustled the tall grass. This land, this house, this quiet, none of it had been meant for me. But now I was the only one left to carry its stories. And I would carry them. Not out of obligation, but out of respect for the complicated man I had loved, even when I didn't fully know him. I walked to the end of the porch and sat on the top step. The boards were cool beneath me. I looked out across the darkened yard and thought about the woman in the small white house down the lane. Kind, steady, honest. And the daughter, grown now, living her own life. Pieces of him continued in them, just as much as in me. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel betrayal. What I felt was a quiet understanding. A strange, unexpected grace that comes only when the truth finally settles into place. For a long while I simply breathed, listened. Let the night hold me. The farm no longer felt like a place I wasn't supposed to enter. It felt like a place I had arrived at exactly when I needed to. Eventually, I rose to my feet and walked back inside. I gathered the letters, old and new, into the wooden box. I placed the photo of him and the little girl on top, the 3 of them frozen in a moment I could finally look at without my chest tightening. Then I closed the lid, gently, almost reverently. This wasn't a box of betrayal anymore. It was a box of truth. Before leaving, I turned off the lights and took one last glance around the house. It no longer felt like a burden. It felt like the final piece of a story that needed to be whole. I locked the door, slid the keys into my pocket, and walked back toward my car. As I stood beside it, I looked toward the dirt road, the same one that had brought me here earlier. It stretched out ahead, quiet and unassuming. I knew I'd return to the farm again. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but someday. Not to search, not to question, but to honor the truth I had found here. I opened the car door, paused, and whispered into the night, I'm ready now. Not ready to forget. Not ready to forgive everything. Just ready to move forward, with the whole story, not the half I lived. And with that, I drove away from the farm for the first time, not lost, not broken, but finally knowing the road ahead.